call on Dr. Ken McHardy, who's well known to you for his work here in Aberdeen. Aberdeen-born, University of Aberdeen graduate of medicine, specialist in diabetes at the Royal Infirmary, leading the diabetes service, and Associate Dean of Education in North Scotland, and upon retirement has given his heart and soul to the interest in diabetes history, and especially to J.J.R. Macleod, for which he is now unequivocally an authoritative person regarding Macleod. His talk is J.J.R. Macleod of Aberdeen and Toronto, Nobel scientist, Nobel laureate. Come forward, please, Ken.
Thank you very much, John and everyone for being here. This is going to be, you'll be surprised to hear me saying after so many insulin talks, a novel experience, because I discovered 20 minutes ago that my slides have been kindly reformatted by the IT technicians, and they're now, to paraphrase Eric Morecambe, we've got all the right pictures, but not necessarily in the right place. So this is going to be as much of a surprise to me as it might be to you. Those panels were in a nice pastel blue that they've now turned pink. Anyway, this shows Macleod in front of Aberdeen and Toronto around 1920, a time, as we've heard, that a diagnosis of what we now know as type 1 diabetes was fatal. And the only treatment was a miserable existence on a near-starvation diet. In the interests of propriety, these are all the picture credits I could find. Don't read them. Let's begin and end with some quotations. First quotation from the Toronto Daily Star. Professor Macleod honoured at a dinner for medical men. And this says that he was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, physiologist in the world. Toronto Daily Star, so it must be right. Next, we have this quote. It's quite clear that at this moment in time, we're talking about 1920, Professor Macleod was as well placed as anyone anywhere to direct a revolutionary breakthrough, producing a clinically useful extract of the long elusive internal pancreatic factor. This is from the Canadian Journal of Health History and written by this esteemed author. I declare no bias. Also, what about this one? If you listen to Scotland's only talking statue, Professor Macleod himself will tell you, in this corner of Scotland, we're not that inclined to sing our own praises. So that's something of the background to Macleod's story. Now, rather than Professor Dirks suggesting I would do 1921 to 23, just hold on to your seats and we'll try to do 1876 to 1935 in the next very few minutes. So, Aberdeen roots are such that Professor Macleod starts with the birth of his father, Clythe, up near the top of the map, Caithness. He proceeded 250 miles, or 400 kilometres for the modern people, to the University of Aberdeen, where he studied in 1862, graduated 1866, and taught at a local school just along the road from this building, while he attended night classes in theology. He moved to Dundee, that's a bit further down the right-hand side of the map, to what became the Ogilvie Free Church as a missioner, and was subsequently ordained, and then moved a little bit north and west to the hamlet of Cluny in Perthshire, near Dunkeld, where he was married And on the eve of his first wedding anniversary, his firstborn child, John James Rickard, was born 148 years ago today. We could come back tomorrow if there's any leftover cake and have a wedding anniversary celebration. So 1876, the minister was then, 3 years later, relocated to Keith in Banffshire, a bit north and west of Aberdeen. And then in 1883, late 83, moved to Aberdeen. So the Macleods were back in Aberdeen, and that's where young Jack would have his education. The photograph is of Robert Macleod and his wife in 1923, just weeks before the Nobel announcement. So Macleod lived in 86 Rosemount Place, and he went to Aberdeen Grammar School, where a few fine people have been educated. Aberdeen Grammar School at that time was more than 600 years old, but this fine granite building had been re-established in city centre 1863, so about 20 years before Macleod went there. And there's a picture of young Jack Macleod in his class. He did very well at school, and he moved on to the University of Aberdeen. This was the university that had an amalgamation of King's College on this site and Marischal College in 1860, and medical teaching was done at Marischal College, which in those days looked like the picture with an open quadrangle. Subsequently, it's been encased with a grand granite building. But this is how it looked at the time of Macleod's studies. And of course, while he was a student, family moved house to number 15 King's Gate. So that's his second Aberdeen residence. And Macleod did very well as a student, won a variety of prizes, and came under the influence of John McWilliam, a pioneering cardiac physiologist who I sadly don't have time to tell you any more about. But under McWilliam's influence, Macleod would become an academic physiologist. And I might have thought, well, why would you do that? You've been trained to be a doctor, go and deal with diseases. But of course, there was very little known properly about any of the science or physiology, chemistry, or whatever at the time. So this was a very noble path to follow. So Macleod's first part of his training was to go to Leipzig. He won the Anderson Travelling Fellowship just after he graduated and went to Leipzig, and he studied there for a year. He came back to Aberdeen, where he worked for another year, and then he moved on to London, where he was first a demonstrator in physiology, then a lecturer, and he even had the esteemed title of pathological chemist to the London Hospital. Let's look at his physiology training. This would nowadays be called a personal development plan, wouldn't it? 5 years training, and it had three main issues with one overlying nuisance, which is administration. So he studied and learnt about research, he learnt about teaching, and he learnt about publishing. And if we look at part of this, the research was interesting because although physiological studies on animal models and different systems, respiratory system, circulatory system, were known, the new thing that he did when he went to Leipzig was to study physiological chemistry. And again, those of us who are quite used to people talking about, I went to the doctor and I had a blood test that tested 20 things, need to remember there were no routine blood tests at the time. And so he was at the forefront of developing what in physiological practice would become biochemistry, and in medical practice would become clinical biochemistry, or sometimes chemical pathology. So that, for example, is one of his early studies, cerebral circulation. On the other side, these are the paraphernalia of physiological chemistry, which was just at its dawning. And at the bottom, we've got his first book that he published. And of course, publication needs to, cover research. He had to publish his research work, as he did. But also teaching means writing textbooks for people. And that was the first collaborative textbook that Macleod was involved in in 1902, and that was a thing that he would continue with. He did so well as a trainee that in 1903 he was recruited to be the new professor of physiology at Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. He married his sweetheart, and they set sail just at the end of August. So either the day before or the day after he arrived in New York, he would have turned 27. And that was to take up professor's chair in Cleveland. So that was his first professorship. As we've already heard, he was headhunted by Chairman Robert Faulkner to go to Toronto, and he spent 10 years there from 1918. His final one, and for people who don't understand the local vernacular, we describe a chair as a cheer here. Some of my slides have got 3 cheers for Macleod on it, because this was his third chair of physiology, Regius Professor in Aberdeen. So what did he do in each of these jobs? Well, Cleveland, he taught physiology and biochemistry. Administration, that was the overarching thing I didn't put on my PDP triangle because it would have put anybody off. But he was very substantially involved in working towards a new medical building and was invited back in 1924 to open the new medical school when it came into play. Research was quite phenomenal. Oh, here's the boxes, not necessarily in the right place. Carbohydrate metabolism became his focus. He had a remarkable series of 12 papers, prospectively numbered, in the American Journal of Physiology between 1907 and 1917. He wrote a number of other papers as well. And in 1913, this is his first monograph, Diabetes, Its a Pathological Physiology. Publishing, during his time at Cleveland, 4 books. And perhaps most remarkably there is that one of them was a book on organic chemistry that he was the co-author of the first edition. I only recently discovered that one. So when he moved on to Toronto, teaching was hands-on and innovative. So he made all sorts of discoveries that people have been rediscovering since, for example, including non-traditional medical topics in medical student teaching. Journals Club, and he got the curriculum increased by a year so that students could spend more time doing practical classes in the laboratory. Administration, insulin shouldn't be there, it should be on the right-hand side, big letters. So he had lots of administrative duties as the Associate Dean. He was appointed, new post in Toronto, but also insulin was a huge piece of administrative work because as soon as the discovery of clinically useful insulin was made, he was increasingly and extremely busy in trying to manage the regulated release of insulin to the world without charlatans coming along and pretending they'd made something even better. Research, as Jim Wright said, he was working on acid-base balance, but of course with the advent of the insulin work, that became a huge focus of research. That should always also be further right in the slide. And then we've got a bit of a spoiler here when we're misaligned, but we've got the Toronto 4 doing the discovery of insulin. We've already heard who they all are. We've already heard about Michael Bliss's book, which for those of you who want to read it, I don't have time in 58 years and 15 minutes to tell you about the discovery of insulin. That's the place to read that. And the Canadian Journal of Health History write-up of our workshop, Toronto Medical Historical Club workshop in 22, I would certainly commend the papers of our previous speakers, Chris Ritty on Macleod as an impresario, and Jim Wright on Macleod being maligned, misunderstood, and misrepresented. So that's where you can read about controversy, because we're not doing controversy today. Publishing, which is now a real mess all over my slide, includes such things as in the left-hand corner, a paper on medical education that he wrote in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 1920. It was always a big theme for Macleod. And the other thing in the bottom right-hand corner is his main textbook, Physiology and Biochemistry in Modern Medicine, which he would have extensively worked on in Cleveland, but it was actually published late enough that Toronto was his address given in the first edition. And that ran to include even 3 posthumous editions. When he came back to Aberdeen in 1928, he was still interested in hands-on teaching, but I've added, while able, to remind me to say that in his latter years in Toronto, he was developing rheumatoid disease, which greatly limited, in the end, his ability to travel and to work. Administratively, he was the Dean of Medicine in Aberdeen for several years, and he was also an advisor, medical advisor to the Privy Council. That's a government body, which meant 8 trips up and down to London per year. He continued to research on insulin. He was joining 3 institutions, so his own laboratory in the University of Aberdeen, but also the Torrey Fishery Research Laboratory and the Laureate Research Institute. And he was still very active in mentoring scientists. And I'm sorry I don't have time to tell you some of the heroes that he mentored. But in terms of publishing, he was still on 4 editorial boards. He published 7 original papers in his time in Aberdeen. And that is a picture of the 7th edition of his textbook, which had then been renamed Physiology in Modern Medicine. And that was probably the last tangible piece of work he did. That was issued on the 1st of January 1935, 7th edition. And he'd written to his publisher hoping to be able to edit the next edition. But it wasn't to be, because he died in the spring of 1935. So just like my slide credits, I don't want you to read the contents of all of these boxes. But here's our unassuming chap, nice Crombie coat, probably from across the River Don there, and a lovely hat, but not a bullish, imposing fellow. Academically, he had his MB degree. He won the travelling scholarship. He was also a Mackinnon Scholar of the Royal Society when he was in London. And he got at least 5 honorary degrees. He was chair of physiology, as I've already shown you, in 3 different universities, spanning almost 32 years. He had other senior offices, Associate Dean in Toronto, Dean of Medicine at the University of Aberdeen, and visiting professor at McGill in Montreal, Stanford, California, Johns Hopkins, Baltimore. He had umpteen fellowships. Work out the alphabet yourself if you've got time. He had many special named lectureships on both sides of the Atlantic. He had additional promoted posts, President of the Royal Canadian Institute of Science, President of the the American Physiological Association, at the time insulin was being discovered, President of the Aberdeen Grammar School Former Pupils. What else could you want? And very posthumous Canadian Medical Hall of Fame. In summary, he had produced 200 papers and 100 what nowadays in soccer, for our transatlantic guests, or football, are called assists. So that's the person who gives the last pass before the goal's scored. So there's about 100 papers his input were acknowledged on that he wasn't a co-author of. And he wrote 12 books, including 3 monographs. So that's his achievements and accolades. But let's do something more convincing. And let's deal with some personal tributes by those who knew him. I think he wasn't quite as squashed as this, but that's a reformatting issue. So let's start with John Boyd Orr, who we've heard about earlier today, some of us. He was the first director of the Laureate Research Institute and went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1949 for services to global nutrition. Boyd Orr is the first of 4 obituaries that I'm going to read you from, excerpts from, by people who knew Macleod and knew his values. Boyd Orr said, "A great investigator and inspiring teacher with a burning enthusiasm for scientific research. Loath to discourage, he was at his best in collaborative teamwork. He had a gift for friendship, sense of fun and good fellowship, and was a lovable personality of most modest demeanour." If we move on to A.H., who everybody knows as Archibald Hill, who was the 1922 Nobel Prize winner in physiology for work on muscle. Hill said in the Quarterly Journal of Experimental Physiology, "Macleod had the power to interest the dullest and fascinate the most acute intelligence. He had a vivid, many-sided and engaging personality and was a man of broadest culture, equally entertaining as host or guest. He had a bright and open countenance, an utter lack of affectation, and endeared himself by his humour and his loyal and affectionate disposition." One more, Edward Cathcart. He was the professor of physiology at the University of Glasgow from 1928 to 1947. Cathcart said in the obituaries of Fellows of the Royal Society, "Researchers could not have wished for a more sympathetic, enthusiastic and stimulating mentor. Devoid of any trace of affectation or pride, he was endowed with an engaging personality. An honest man thinking evil of none, he was loyal, affectionate and abhorred backbiting. He was an optimist who met everyone with a smile. He refused to be depressed by ill fortune as his serene and happy spirit triumphed." And finally, topic of the last presentation, Bert Collip, writing in the Biochemical Journal. He supplied encouragement and all the practical assistance at his disposal. He would not allow an enthusiastic colleague to embark on an investigation without pointing out technical and theoretical difficulties. Distinguished by cheerfulness, kindness, and patience, he was always willing to discuss juniors' problems. So in summary, I hope my brief life history and the words of his close colleagues have shown Jack Macleod to be a worthy Nobel laureate and have convinced you that he was indeed a most noble scientist and educator. I should like to think that his generous, collaborative instincts would have brought his wholehearted and grateful approval to this morning's developments in Duthie Park. Thank you.